I thought I'd start off with sharing the law of requisite complexity, which states that it takes complexity to defeat complexity, that a system must possess complexity that's equal to that of its environment in order to function effectively. And the reason I wanted to start with this is that, at least in my experience, I've found that most organizations are not good at leveraging their own complexity to defeat complexity. And so it's my hope tonight to kind of share with you, how you can do this for the organizations that you work with or for in your particular context. So, in knowing that it takes complexity to defeat complexity, I thought it might be of some value to share with you a little bit of the complexity sciences. In this particular case, the definition of what we refer to as a complex adaptive system. So, a complex adaptive system is a system that's made up of many parts, often called agents, which can be people, ideas, departments, other organizations, and where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We can define a complex adaptive system as a system where the interactions of the agents produce emergent patterns that lead to emergent outcomes that often are difficult, if not impossible, to predict. And it's through those interactions of agents, those patterns, that creates this feedback loop, this top-down governing constraint that influences future actions, or interactions rather, and behaviors. And so I find this image from Glenda Oyang pretty helpful. And as it shows, there's a number of agents interacting in a nonlinear way. And it's the sum of those interactions that produce these global system-wide patterns. And it's those system-wide patterns that in turn influence in a top-down causative way future interactions and behaviors of those same agents. So there's a couple of ways to think about complex adaptive systems with regards to our discussion tonight. One is complex adaptive systems are organizations that we work with and for. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that we can manufacture a complex adaptive system to bring about transformative change. And it's the latter complex adaptive system that we're going to be focusing on tonight. So, with a brief description of what complexity is, what does it look like? In nature, complexity manifests as birds flocking, also known as murmurations. And you can see the interesting pattern that emerges there in that complex adaptive system. It also manifests in the form of a rainforest, where there is an untold amount of agents, interactions, and entanglement that is occurring in the rainforest. In society, complexity manifests as traffic flows, and increasingly it manifests as the Internet of Things, as both our personal and professional lives seem to become more integrated and connected with technology. In organizations, complexity manifests as a formal organization chart, and it manifests in the form of a network diagram, the organization chart being the formal view, and the network diagram being the informal view of an organization. And within each of us, complexity manifests as a neuronal network within our brain and as our nervous system. So, complexity seemingly exists everywhere. So, how might we characterize complexity? To say that something is complex is to say that something reflects the following characteristics: that it reflects mass diversity, it reflects patterning, as we just saw with some of the examples. It reflects a disposition, a state condition. Complex adaptive systems reflect a large number of elements, and they have a history about them. They maintain a memory. They don't forget their history. Complex adaptive systems also have a number of indirect and direct feedback loops. They reflect a self-organization and a path dependency. Complex adaptive systems also reflect dynamic interactions. They reflect a certain amount of emergence. And they reflect nonlinearity, also known as the butterfly effect. Complex adaptive systems also reflect mass entanglement. This is all things are connected. They reflect adaptability and in order chaos underlying dynamics. We'll talk more about that later tonight. They reflect phase transitions. And with any type of change that you introduce into a complex adaptive system, of course, there's unintended consequences. So these are all the various ways that we might characterize a complex adaptive system. So with that sort of brief intro of what complexity is, we ask, why should we leverage complexity? With leveraging complexity, we can solve those challenges faster, encounter little to no resistance when doing so, and the interventions that we introduce sustains over time. So I often kind of think of this as sort of the holy grail of not only what I'm looking for as a change agent, but oftentimes what the leaders or the executive sponsors are looking for. They're looking for fast change with little to no resistance and that sustains over time. And that's what we get when we leverage complexity. So the balance of this presentation will show you sort of how we do this. So I'm going to quickly define what is a complex adaptive challenge. I don't want to assume that that you already know this. So a complex adaptive challenge is the type of challenge that's difficult for people to agree on what the specific issue is or how best to solve it. It's the type of challenge where applying existing process and procedures and know-how, expertise, it doesn't provide the solution needed. They're the types of challenges where some solutions emerge not from the expertise that one possesses or even the title that one holds, but from a process of bringing together a highly diverse team of actors that have agreed to come together to learn and adapt and challenge one another to achieve a common goal. They're the types of challenges that require influencing and altering mental models of individuals in an ethical way, in addition to transforming relationships and interactions of those that participate in the change effort. It's the type of challenges that requires experimenting our way forward. And finally, there are the types of challenges that require changes in numerous places, usually across organizational boundaries. So it requires a system of change, is kind of how I describe it. There's no silver bullet. So this is how we define a complex adaptive challenge. Some examples of complex adaptive challenges would be, for example, how can we transform our culture to be more collaborative? How can we deliver a winning customer experience consistently? How can we comply with new government regulations? How do we respond to losing a patent or the rise of a new competitor? How can we reinvent our brand? And how can we cut costs but not operational effectiveness? So not that these are exactly the issues that I'm addressing with my clients, but they follow the same format. It's kind of how can we do this? How do we do that? And they're the types of challenges, again, that often require a team of diverse individuals coming together to solve for, as opposed to you as the change expert sort of leading the effort. So it's also important to know that with complex adaptive challenges, you can't analyze your way out of the challenge. And this is due to mass entanglement. And so, as Dave Snowden would say, we need to work with the evolutionary potential of the present. And so the process that we follow, and I'll have some illustrations later in the presentation to kind of go deeper on this, is that we start with mapping the current state of the system. We then determine what patterns are visible in the system, including determining those patterns that we want more of and less of. We then identify the structural constraints that are holding those existing patterns in place. And then we articulate a desired direction of travel towards better. So as opposed to identifying a a point target or point estimate, we simply identify or articulate a direction of travel that we want to head in. We then determine the dispositionality of the system to change, including identifying adjacent possible states that might represent our opening moves. We brainstorm for strategic options to shift those constraints, and then we deploy experimental probes and monitor weak signals for change. So again, this is the process that that I'll share with you in sort of illustrative form later in our presentation. And the last thing to say about this is that in solving complex problems or challenges, we're not solving the problem per se, as we are shifting patterns. And the reason for that is that with every intervention, you're actually changing the system. And it might result in a new set of problems or challenges. So at best, what we're doing is we're shifting patterns to increase sort of the degree of fit for the environment that we're working in. But we don't actually ever really sort of, quote unquote, solve the problem. So with that, we ask sort of the central question in this presentation, which is how does one leverage complexity? And there are three strategies that we can employ. The first one is to expose complexity, both inner system complexity and outer system complexity. We can design for complexity. It's the second strategy. And the third strategy is to work with complexity. So I'm going to share with you some of the sort of key actions and those specific characteristics of complexity that we're indeed leveraging to solve for our complex challenge. So with strategy number one, with exposing complexity, the actions that we perform here to do this are to expose, for example, our inner system complexity. So this gets to exposing, let's say, our uncritically held assumptions, our cognitive biases, our limiting beliefs, and making those visible for challenge and possible revision. We also need to expose elements within our outer system. And so, for example, we need to expose the key stakeholders, the organizations, maybe the broader ecosystem that's participating in solving this particular challenge. We need to expose the system's history, its memory. We need to understand its past in the present so that we can help transform its future. We need to expose difference in a system. So this gets to exposing the points of view, the different perspectives and positions that might exist amongst the agents within the system. And we, most importantly, want to expose the current state patterns of the system, including its dispositional states to change. So these actions, in turn, leverage the following complexity characteristics of diversity and history, memory, path dependency, and so on. And so in leveraging these characteristics, we're actually able to achieve strategy number one of exposing complexity, which is just one of the three things that we need to do to solve for our complex adaptive challenge. The second strategy is design for complexity. And here we begin by designing a conversational architecture that considers the past, present, and future in the same ongoing conversation. In addition to that, we look to design or create the conditions for change to occur. This is largely about container building, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. We look to design for our generative event or process or even longer term platform that will be used as the catalyst to both expose our inner system complexity, but then more importantly, hope to revise or challenge that complexity. And we also design for phase shifts to occur, transitions to occur in people seeing, thinking, acting, and feeling. So in performing these actions, we're leveraging a whole different set of complexity characteristics. Again, those characteristics help us achieve this strategy number two. And then finally, with strategy number 3, we work with complexity. So we work with complexity by experimenting our way forward to leverage the iterative method. We work with complexity by measuring change indirectly, that is through oblique means. We work with complexity by establishing a light governance model to amplify what works and dampen what doesn't. And then we also work with complexity by resetting and coaching leadership on how best to support dialogic-inspired, experimentally driven work. And as before, this strategy represents or has its own set of complexity characteristics that we're leveraging. So the question may become at this point, how do we execute this work in a consistent and effective manner? With that question in mind, I'd like to introduce to you what I'm calling the complexity leadership theory of change model. So this is an informal theory. It's sort of in process and being tested out. In short, I call it the complexity leadership model. And I define this model as a modern, rapid, inquiry-based, foresight-driven strategic learning model. So let me share with you kind of each element of that definition. So when I say modern, what I'm talking about here is that this model, the complexity leadership model, reflects a new understanding of the role and amplified potential of integrating diagnostic OD, dialogic OD, and experiential learning into a unified problem-solving methodology. When I speak of rapid, I'm speaking to how the experiential sequence within the complexity leadership model is rooted in the iterative method, whereby self-organized teams are delivering value every 2 to 4 weeks via agile sprints. Inquiry-based speaks to the core of the model, whereby we leverage dialogic and inquiry-based tools and techniques to do what I had mentioned earlier, which is to expose those uncritically held assumptions, those cognitive biases, the limiting beliefs for challenge and possible revision. Foresight-driven speaks to how strategic foresight is a differentiating social technology of the complexity leadership model, whereby we are engaging with the emerging future to transform the present. So this is largely about engaging the edges of the organization, its industry, and perhaps even the broader ecosystem in which it operates. And finally, strategic learning speaks to how the intent and essence of the complexity leadership model is less about producing certain results or outcomes than about strategic learning. In this particular case, learning, for example, about how best to solve a complex adaptive challenge. So that's kind of how we define the complexity leadership model. I want to share with you now sort of 3 defining frameworks that underlie the model. The first framework is what I refer to as a universal change framework, which operates at macro level. And what we're trying to do here is to initiate 4 shifts amongst the convened team that has been brought together to solve for the complex challenge. Those 4 shifts are to create a shared understanding of what the issue, challenge, opportunity, or problem is, followed by creating a shared intention of where to go, about creating a common goal and getting everyone rowing in the same direction. Following that, we look to create aligned actions, both individually and collectively, as people start role modeling the new. And then finally, we're looking to transform relations all along the way. So we're looking to establish new relations, deepen existing relations, and restore fractured relations. And so these 4 shifts reflect the key outcomes in solving for a complex adaptive challenge. And as we do this, as we initiate these 4 shifts, we want to allocate 70% of our time towards creating that shared understanding, with 20% allocated to creating that shared intention and 10% to creating aligned actions. I have found in my experiences that only when I have allocated and emphasized this, this upfront step of creating shared understanding amongst a highly diverse group of individuals that have come together, only in doing that do we actually ever get to a point of creating a shared intention uh, leading to aligned actions? So hence is why we spend so much time up front in creating a shared understanding. The second framework is called the innovation sequence framework. This operates at meso level and is reflective of three key movements. The first movement is a diagnostic movement where we're planning to learn, and we do this as we expose difference. This is followed by a dialogic movement where we're inquiring to learn, now leveraging difference. And finally, this is followed by an experiential sequence where we're discovering to learn by integrating difference. So these are the three sequences, or rather three movements together that we refer to as our innovation sequence. And then finally, we leverage the Pearl framework, which operates at micro level and is comprised of 5 phases of plan, experiment, assess, reflect, and learn. This is an adaptation of the plan, do, check, act model. And we use the Pearl framework to direct all efforts of the 3 sequences. So the diagnostic sequence, the dialogic sequence, and the experiential sequence. And it's for that reason that I refer to it as our inner flywheel of change. So in bringing it all together then, when solving for a complex adaptive challenge, we're initiating these 4 macro level shifts of shared understanding, shared intention, aligned actions, and transforming relations all along the way. Within those macro level shifts, we're initiating 3 movements: a diagnostic movement, followed by a dialogic movement, followed by an experiential movement. And then finally, within each of those 3 movements, we leverage the Pearl framework of plan, experiment, assess, reflect, and learn. That's sort of the high-level view of the complexity leadership model, its definition, and the underlying frameworks that sort of bring the model to life. So with that, I will dive deep now into the 3 strategies that we looked at earlier, beginning with exposing complexity. Exposing complexity, by the way, reflects the diagnostic sequence in the innovation sequence framework. In the diagnostic sequence, our work is simply to observe, observe, observe. And we primarily do this through story collection and 2 principal methods of leveraging narrative harvesting survey instruments and anecdote circles. And the principal method that we use is P&I, or participatory narrative inquiry, from Cynthia Kurtz. And if you're unfamiliar with P&I, the 3 elements of it are: it's participatory, meaning that people not only source their own stories, but then they self-signify, they self-interpret those stories. And the value of that is that it avoids bias from me or you as an expert trying to understand their context and then trying to interpret what those stories mean. So this avoids the inherent bias that would naturally occur if a change agent was performing that interpretation. So it's very participatory. It's rich in its narrative. Collecting stories allows us to capture much richer detail in terms of the values, the beliefs, the feelings, and the perspectives that you just can't get from standard surveys, from focus groups, or even from dialogue interviews. And so there's a narrative component that provides powerful, actionable feedback. And then the inquiry part speaks to what Cynthia has here, which is that somebody always finds out something useful about something. And in fact, the quote that I love most about Cynthia in her book, Working with Stories, is it gets to the essence of P&I, which is that it's about getting stories to where they need to go. And if you think about sort of your own change efforts, how often is it the case that that we say, boy, if this person just sort of understood sort of this aspect of the problem, they would change their mindset and support the initiative. So So this resonates quite a bit with me, which is that um, we're looking to get stories to where they need to go, and in doing that, helping us solve for the complex adaptive challenge. The emphasis in this particular sequence, the diagnostic sequence, is not about conducting a diagnosis to determine what is wrong with the system. It's about surfacing different narratives and different mental models that collectively define the system. So the essence of this sequence is really about exposing difference, and it's about exposing a system's past, its history. And as Dr. Ray may say, or would say, we're performing diagnostic work, but through a dialogic lens, that is, with a dialogic spirit to it. And such differences then serve as our raw material to raise awareness of the differences that exist within the system. So the different perspectives and points of views, issues, themes, and patterns that exist. And our emphasis here, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is to focus on the patterns that we're seeing of language, of perceptions, and of experiences amongst the key stakeholders. And then this content ultimately serves as our starting point to engage in system-wide dialogue and meaning making with diverse others. So it creates a platform for us for later exploration and action. So that sort of very quickly described sort of exposing complexity in our outer system. I'm now going to share over the next couple slides how we expose complexity in our inner system, which is invariably harder to do. And so the key here to facilitate a staged descent into an ever-deepening transformative space is to develop a self-awareness in one's seeing, thinking, acting, and feeling. And so the question becomes, how do we do this? Well, there are 6 strategies I want to share with you. The first strategy comes from David Bohm in his work, and in specifically his book, Thought as a System, where we think in terms of our brain as a thought factory that's just producing all of these thoughts, both random and planned. And in thinking in terms of our brain this way, it sort of equips us or enables us in certain sort of meaningful ways, which is that number one, when we think of our brain as a thought factory, we can have the thought that we are not our thoughts, that we have thoughts. It's equivalent of kind of saying that, I have emotions, I'm not my emotions, that type of thing. It also enables us to start to notice our thoughts, to simply dangle them in front of us with curiosity, with wonderment of, oh, why did I think of that? And it also equips us, probably most importantly, that we can have the realization that we're the general manager of the factory. And hence we can control what comes out of the factory. And this is important as it relates to the difference between responding to an individual versus reacting to an individual. So thought as a system, or thinking of our brain as a thought factory, is one way that we can develop a self-awareness to facilitate a staged descent to more of a transformative space. Another strategy comes from the work of Mezirow, which is to know thyself. And this is about, again, exposing our uncritically held assumptions, our cognitive biases, our limiting beliefs for challenge and possible revision. It's about making us aware of our habits of expectation towards things in life, and making us aware of our mental and behavioral triggers in terms of when and what. And it's also about making us aware that, for each of us, we possess or hold significant cognitive blind spots, and this being the result of our narrow lived history. And as a result, sort of our narrow seeing, thinking, acting, and feeling that goes with that. Another strategy to develop self and others' awareness comes from the work of Sharma from the Presencing Institute, where he describes 4 levels of listening. And in the first level, He says that we do not listen at all, that we speak within our own construct, from within our own ego. This represents downloading and essentially reconfirming what we already know. And the famous phrase here is that we do not listen, we reload. At a level 2 level of listening, we're now listening from the periphery of things. He refers to this as factual listening, where we're now sort of noticing new data, we're noticing disconfirming data, and that being an improvement over downloading. At level 3, we're listening from outside of our construct, from within the shoes of another. So this is referred to as empathic listening, where we're now seeing through the eyes of another. And that being a significant improvement over factual listening. And finally, there's level 4 listening, which is we're listening from the emerging field of what wants to emerge. He refers to this as generative listening, where we're now connecting to the field, to the future whole of things. And our goal with these 4 levels of listening, by the way, is to minimally operate at a level 3 level of listening. Now, the significance of educating those that you're working with on these levels of listening is that the quality of our listening impacts the quality of our conversing. And so this, so there's 4 levels of conversing that comes from the work of Isaacs. In the first level, he talks about how we talk nice to each other, that we're reflecting a politeness towards one another. And while that's great, it doesn't expose the perspectives and points of views that are so necessary to bring about transformative change. And so we need to develop a deeper level of conversing. And so at level 2, we deepen the level of conversing to that of a debate, where now indeed we are exposing our perspectives, our points of views, our positions on things. And this represents an improvement over level 1. But again, it's dysfunctional in that I'm talking past you and you're talking past me. And so the reality of us realizing transformative change at this level of conversing is unlikely. So we need to descend deeper to level 3, where we start to engage in a reflective dialogue, where now I'm asking questions of you and you're asking questions of me, and we're genuinely trying to understand each other's perspective. So this represents a significant improvement in the quality of conversing over level 2. And then finally, at level 4, this represents flow, where we're engaging in what wants to emerge, also referred to as generative dialogue. So as with the 4 levels of listening, the 4 levels of conversing, we want to be at levels 3 and 4. This will allow us to be more successful in solving for our complex adaptive challenge. This 5th strategy is something that I developed mostly out of my own frustration in not being able to, let's say, stay awake in the moment. And it's referred to in the literature as maintaining an attitude of reception. So I think of this as kind of key remembrances. And the framework is what I tell myself, what I watch for, and what I remember to do. So some of the things that I tell myself, for example, is that I am not my point of view, that I have a point of view, that my perspective regarding anything in life is fragmented, representing but part of the broader whole, and to be open to being influenced by others. What I watch for is the level of listening amongst people, the level of conversation amongst people, and team effectiveness better practices, which comes from the work of Schwartz. And then finally, I remember, I have a set of remembrances on what to do. And principally, it's about staying awake, of being conscious of my thoughts in the moment, and watching for my thoughts as they occur. In addition to that, it's about respecting other voices, giving legitimacy to others' lived history, and treating the person to the right of you and to the left of you as teacher. And then finally, practicing courageous speak when so moved. And then the final strategy is about suspension. This also comes from the work of Sharma, where he says that there's essentially 2 key suspensions that need to occur here to facilitate this staged descent. The first strategy is to suspend our inner chatter, to focus on others' comments, to focus on others' perspectives and points of view. This gets back to a little bit of what we talked earlier about practicing deep empathy. But in addition to that, we also need to suspend judgment of others, to practice continuous curiosity, to adopt that beginner's mind. And again, as mentioned earlier, this fundamentally is about us responding to others as opposed to reacting to others. So this is about managing our reactivity loop. So with these 6 strategies, and these are strategies, for example, that I would educate and coach those that I'm working with on, we can become more complexity capable. We can leverage these strategies to expose our inner system complexity to solve our complex challenges. Next, we talk about designing for complexity, which speaks to the dialogic sequence of the innovation sequence framework. And the dialogic sequence is arguably the most important sequence within the complexity leadership model, as it's here that we're actually transforming what people see and how they think, act, and feel about the challenge in front of them. And so this manifests in the form of an inquiry or a participative-based event, which could operate from days to weeks. It could be a process that operates for weeks to months, or it could even be a platform that operates for years. And with dialogic and inquiry-based work, the change results from both changing the chairs and changing the conversation. So when I speak of changing the chairs, talking about convening a requisite diverse team of system actors and doing this to holistically speak to both the underlying issues and the possible solutions. So this is fundamentally about maximizing both cognitive and demographic diversity amongst the team that we've convened. Changing the conversation speaks to both the what of the conversation and the how. The what being the stories and narratives that we've captured in the diagnostic sequence, and that representing sort of a more authentic source of the current state dynamics of the system. And then the how of the conversation is where we're leveraging large group participatory based methods like the World Cafe or open space to intentionally disrupt entrained seeing, thinking, acting, and feeling. So one of the key elements in designing for complexity, in many ways, is designing for flow, and the flow of integrating our past, our present, and future of a system, such that we're looking to understand the past, but in the present to transform our future. And the way that we go about doing this is by developing a conversational architecture that spans diagnostic, dialogic, and experiential. And for each of the sequences, we ask a macro question. The particular question in the diagnostic sequence is, what is the complex adaptive challenge to solve for, and who can best speak to the underlying issues and how best to solve them? In addition to that question, we ask other questions at this stage, which is, what is the prevailing narrative of the complex challenge? What are the current patterns, trends, and issues that we're seeing? What are those notable differences that we're observing amongst system actors? And what is the dispositionality of the system to change? From there, the conversation continues as we're trying to, as it states here in the middle, we're trying to create a movement towards increased coherence. And so the macro question that we ask in the dialogic sequence is, how do we establish a shared understanding, shared intention, and aligned actions while transforming relations? And some of the questions that we ask in this sequence is, what do the patterns mean? What stories do we want more of and less of? What should be our direction of travel? What does the outlier or edge data suggest? What might be our adjacent possible moves? What constraints are keeping these patterns in place? And what might be some options to shift those constraints? Those are just some of the questions that we ask in the dialogic sequence. And then finally, in the experiential sequence, we ask, what is our current threshold of knowledge? And what is the next right thing to pursue or probe? There's a number of questions that we ask in this particular sequence, such as, how are our individual and collective efforts shifting the patterns? What are we learning about that complex adaptive challenge, about the broader system? And which experiments should we amplify, and which of those should we dampen? So these are just some of the questions that we ask. But again, the message here is that we're creating an end-to-end conversational architecture that starts with our diagnostic work. It continues the conversation into dialogic and continues further into the experiential sequence. Now, in addition to designing a conversational architecture, we also need to be intentional with designing our container. Container building, and this will be probably much deeper into complexity than you'd like for. This may be perhaps the most scientific explanation of how to build a container than you've seen, but bear with me here. So with container building, there's a couple key parts to it, and the first part is about setting the context. And the way that we set the context is by intentionally orchestrating a complex mix of context-dependent constraints. So we're leveraging a significant amount of constraints here to create a specific context. And the constraints can be divided into sort of two major buckets. The first bucket are containing constraints. And within there's a couple of subcategories. The first category is attractors. And so the first constraint that we're wanting to establish to set the proper context for our container is to attempt to tackle a complex adaptive challenge. So we need to be tackling something that's of importance, of urgency, that creates a certain amount of pressure. So this serves as an attractor for our container. In addition to that, the identity or the path dependency for each of us individually also can serve as an attractor. And so when you think about those that you would convene to participate in solving for a complex adaptive challenge, you really want to give some intentional, rigorous thought to who to invite, because some individuals could indeed serve as an attractor that might, for example, encourage others to participate in solving the challenge. So our profile, our lived history, can serve as an important attractor constraint. Another subcategory in the containing constraints bucket is boundaries. And one constraint here is this idea of containment. So this speaks not only to physical containment, which could be in person or more often these days virtual, but also the sort of the cultural elements that come with convening a very diverse team. So containment is an important boundary constraint, in addition to requisite diversity. So I've mentioned this earlier, we're wanting to maximize diversity in bringing together a group of individuals who can speak to both the underlying issues and how best to solve them. And we need to focus on both cognitive diversity and demographic diversity. The second major bucket of constraints are coupling constraints, and within there's two subcategories. The first subcategory are connections. One connecting constraint is to establish functional, or to ensure rather, functional entanglement. So this speaks to, I can't solve the problem without you, and you can't solve it without me. There's a certain amount of entanglement that exists for us to solve this complex adaptive challenge. In addition to that, we're also looking to establish dynamic network interactions. And we do this in part through the design of our dialogic-based event. We'll have more to talk about that in just a moment. And it's these network interactions then actually sort of feeds into another form of connecting constraint, which is direct and indirect feedback loops. And those feedback loops in turn serve as a sort of top-down governing constraint to change people's mindsets and their behaviors, and ultimately to work a team towards improved or better coherence. And then finally, we've got exchange-based constraints. And two constraints here. One is that we leverage the dialogic method, so dialogic-based engagement, as opposed to, let's say, debate. And then finally, doing what we need to do to create a certain amount of psychological safety and trust. So we've got 9 constraints here, and you may ask the question, like, why these 9? Why couldn't it be a different set of 9? And the reason for that is that these 9 constraints actually represent a constraint architecture or a constraint regime, if you will. And what's notable about all of these sort of connections is the box in the middle, where between functional entanglement, dynamic network interactions, dialogic-based engagement, and these direct and indirect feedback loops, it creates this autocatalytic effect, straddling between chaos and order, where new knowledge and information is being generated, which subsequently changes the context. And over the course of time, over multiple iterations that are occurring, it produces this top-down second-order governing constraint. And in fact, this second-order governing constraint actually produces what's referred to as a basin of attraction. It creates a new possibility space for us, a new possibility space of change where new patterns and behaviors are emerging. There's increasing interdependence with a sort of every spin of the wheel, so to speak. We're having increasing coordination dynamics as I learn your perspective and points of view and you learn of mine. And with each turn of the wheel, we are increasing coherence. So again, these aren't just a random set of constraints. They actually feed and interconnect with one another. And most importantly, they create this autocatalytic effect, which produces this top-down governing constraint, which is actually the mechanism by which that people start changing their mindsets and behaviors. And so it's from this constraint architecture that creates part B of our container, which is generating a certain ambiance. So this constraint architecture acts in sort of a top-down causative manner to generate certain atmospheric conditions, conditions of autocatalytic dynamics, of conflicting, tension, and friction, of disruption, uncertainty, and instability. It creates conditions of rapidly changing needs and nonlinear emergence of new ideas, new behaviors, and novelty. It creates conditions of mutually dependent relations as the interdependencies deepen and expand with each turn of the wheel. And it creates these autocorrelated patterns of energy where initially we might have more of a me orientation, parts to whole, and that's sort of evolving to more of a we orientation, whole to parts. Again, this comes back to that top-down second order governing constraint. And finally, if we've done it right, we still have maintained an atmosphere or conditions of community, connectedness, and trust. So in summary, the ambiance or climate that we've created is really a function of the context that we've orchestrated. That is, it's a product of intentional design. And then so that gives us significant sort of leverage and power as a change agent to generate the right behaviors to get the right results. Together then, part A of setting the context and part B of generating this ambiance, it's these two together that creates the conditions for transformative change to occur. It creates this new possibility space, or in the words of Heifetz, an adaptive space. And so together, context and ambiance serve as disturbing elements that push a system towards chaos. And it's these disturbing elements, this sort of chaos that we've manufactured, that evokes certain adaptive leadership behaviors that results in certain contextually induced patterns, patterns of creativity and innovation, of challenging of assumptions, of changed mindsets, of an aggregation and bonding of ideas. It leads to transformative learning and new narratives and generative images being born. It leads to a self-reflection and awareness of those participating. And it leads to self-organization, correlated action, and people sharing stories and expressing personal vulnerability. And it's from all of these adaptive leadership behaviors that we get the outputs that we're looking for, which is shared understanding, shared intention, aligned actions, and transformed relations. So it's these behaviors that serve as the stabilizing elements that actually push the system back towards order. So once we've designed the conversations, the conversational architecture, and we've established our container, we then look to design a generative event, which brings agents, ideas, and events together to bring our conversational architecture to life. And so what this looks like is that we start with our end goal in mind, solving our complex adaptive challenge. We then think about the movements that will comprise our generative event. We clarify the movements, the diverge, the converge, the emerge movements that will create the flow throughout the generative event. We then think through the different dialogic-based tools that will make up our event, like using the World Cafe or open space technology. We think through the different forms of connectivity that will facilitate those strategic conversations. So individual activities, paired activities, subgroup activities, plenary activities, station-based activities, and so forth. Of course, we need to think through the logistics, whether physical or virtual. And then finally, we give additional thought to the people. Again, we're wanting to maximize diversity, cognitive diversity, and demographic diversity. So in bringing it all together then, our goal is to solve for a complex adaptive challenge. And this requires new learning, innovation, and patterns of behavior. And our approach is to ethically influence and alter mental models of people in the system through transformative interactions and dynamic constraints. And we do this by bringing agents, ideas, and events together in the form of a purpose-driven, complex adaptive system. This gets back to my earlier comment where we can manufacture complex adaptive systems. And so in this regard, we bring these agents together, we bring the system into the room while acknowledging that each person has their own path dependency. And we intentionally orchestrate very complex conditions to contextually induce an integration and interdependence amongst and between agents. This, in turn, as we talked about, evokes emergent adaptive behaviors. Initially, we have behaviors that reflect separate and isolated agents, which then become more interdependent and interlocking agents. This, in the complexity science, is referred to as a many-to-one phase shift. And so if you look at the coordination dynamics in the middle, we see that we have a number of interactions, multiple different constrained interactions and relations occurring amongst people. And it's those interactions that creates this system-level emergent dynamic to serve the whole. So the phase shift that's occurring here is going from more of positions to more of shared interests. And that dynamic feeds back into the broader context such that it then becomes more of a system-wide pattern of influence that's continuing to constrain the context. And it's from that context that ultimately culminates in a governing constraint-induced coordination and synchronicity. A new downward causality-based possibility space is generated, and a self-organized change begins to ripple out coherence. And as we talked about, it's from all of this rippling out that we achieve the key outcomes that we're looking for. So at this point, a new evolutionary state has been reached. Getting back to what the quote I mentioned earlier from Snowden, we work with the evolutionary potential of the present. So very quickly, I know we're getting close on time. I want to wrap this up here in about 5 minutes and see what questions you have. The last part is working with complexity, which speaks to the experiential sequence of the innovation sequence framework. And so in the experiential sequence, the work is to initiate a learn by doing model, to experiment our way forward. This reflects a micro nudging. This, in fact, is where we actually test the evolutionary potential of a system to transform itself. And so experiential work comes after having first established that shared understanding and that shared intention. And as this sequence is about experimentation, the mantra that we adopt is safe to fail, or as I've seen written about quite often now, is safe to try. In addition to experimenting our way forward, this sequence is also representative of us supporting the evaluation of our experimental work. So monitoring weak signals, measuring obliquely, and establishing support structures. So as the change agent, we need to manage a couple of important interfaces. The innovation to organization interface, which is about scaling dialogic-based change, and the administrative to adaptive interface, which is about managing the politics of experimentally driven work. So how does this look like? How do we experiment our way forward? So it begins by acknowledging where we are and then also reconfirming where we want to be. This represents our intended direction of travel. From there, we define our next target condition, also known as our adjacent possible space. So this might manifest as us asking, where do we want to be 2 weeks from now or a month from now? Then we identify what obstacles exist from going from our current condition to our target condition. So this is about identifying those environmental constraints, both internal and external, and making those constraints aware to us. And then we choose which obstacles to focus on first. And then we design the experiments to indirectly shift those system-wide patterns by either amplifying or dampening these known constraints. And then finally, we monitor progress via weak signal detection, and then repeat, asking what is the next right thing. In summary here, when solving for a complex adaptive challenge, we're starting journeys. We're starting a journey in an intended direction of travel. And as we do that, we're remaining open to novel discoveries and adaptation along the way as the nature of the system unfolds. Now, in addition to that, as I've mentioned just a moment ago, we need to measure differently. In fact, we measure the weak signals of change, which means that we're measuring something that we want more of or less of. And so we refer to these weak signals of change as indirect or oblique measures. And they're velocity-based measures. So it speaks to a direction of travel, and it speaks to speed of travel. So for example, one of our oblique measures might be courageous speak, and we're wanting to see more of that. So the first velocity-based measure here would be the direction of travel. We want more courageous speak. And then the second velocity-based measure is speed. How quickly is the group that we're working with, demonstrating or exhibiting courageous speak? Some other indirect or oblique measures are reaction intensity, reaction recovery time, self-awareness of one's thinking and acting, actions aligned with intention or desired direction of travel, and new narratives and generative images taking hold. So with any of these measures, or rather with all of these measures, it can be stated that we want more of this and less of that. One other thing that we need to do, as mentioned earlier, with working with complexities, that we need to reset leadership expectations on their role and responsibilities as it relates to dialogically derived and experimentally driven change. So we need to educate that change is emergent, which is a time and space issue. We can't predict when change will arrive, nor can we predict where it will arrive. This also speaks to dynamic complexity. We need to educate that the results that we're going to get or could get are uncertain. that outcomes are unpredictable when solving for a complex challenge. And as we talked about, as we engage differently, so must we measure differently. We need to measure transformative change indirectly, obliquely. And our intent when bringing out about change is to educate leadership that, as much as we're looking for some type of outcome, that it's also about the learning. And in fact, it might be more about the learning than achieving a predefined outcome. We're also needing to educate that the initiatives that emerge from the dialogic event are best served to be self-organized and self-managed. And then lastly, we educate on the need for them to adopt a servant leader sensibility and demeanor, to encourage, challenge, and support and commit all the various innovation teams as they bring forth the new. And lastly, we need to establish some type of governance structure. So this is typically what I've done in the past. Very simple leadership committee with myself serving as an advisor and bringing together the team leaders of the various self-organized initiatives periodically to talk about their current status, the experiments they're running, the findings, their learnings, talk about the obstacles that they're encountering, any support requirements they have, and so forth. So earlier I asked the question, why should we leverage complexity? So I'm just going to wrap up here and say that we leverage complexity because we can realize faster change. And the way that we can realize faster change is by getting the whole system into the room to see itself, to later transform itself. We get faster change by creating the right conditions for transformative change to occur. We get faster change by disrupting the status quo to initiate phase shifts in how people see, think, act, and feel. And we get faster change because we're encountering little to no resistance along the way. And the way that we ensure little or no resistance is we focus on inner system complexity work. We're building that self-awareness of our uncritically held assumptions, biases, and beliefs that often get in the way of transformative change. So we're educating on that as sort of a proactive means to reduce or eliminate any resistance. Distributed citizen engagement, decision-making, and leadership. This is another way that we ensure little or no resistance. Creating that shared understanding, intention, actions, and developing relations all along the way at the percentages I mentioned of 70, 20, and 10. That's how we produce little to no resistance with our change. Exposing, leveraging, and integrating difference, honoring and harnessing the diversity that exists within an organization is also how we produce little to no resistance. And then finally, considering the past, present, and future of a system in a conversational flow. And lastly, we sustain the gains by adopting a follow the energy experimentation approach, which creates local ownership and commitment. We sustain the gains by redefining and elevating leadership on their changed role and responsibilities. We sustain the gains by establishing a light governance model that supports a probe, sense, and respond form of discovery. And we sustain the gains by measuring transformational change indirectly, that is, obliquely. It is because of all of these factors that we can be wildly successful in solving for really any intractable challenge. And I'll leave you with this, which is how can you lead through complexity? Well, it will require an identity shift from serving as an OD change practitioner to serving as a complexity leader. And a complexity leader is someone who's equipped to consult, host, facilitate, and coach a collective leadership amongst highly diverse others to achieve a common goal. This reflects an enabling leader role in the complexity leadership theory. And three capabilities of complexity leaders are helping diverse others in a system to see the whole of the system and to get people to understand and appreciate the different perspectives and points of views, including people understanding their role in contributing to current conditions. So we refer to this as an out there versus in here also issue. In addition to that, complexity leaders look to create the conditions for transformative change to occur versus trying to make change happen. And finally, complexity leaders help individuals, teams, and the broader system engage with the emerging future to transform the present. So that brings us to the end. For those of you who were sort of intrigued about this content tonight and wanting more, I'll mention that we have a course called Leading Through Complexity. It's an 8-week live workshop-based course. We got a new cohort starting in January. You can register at henosispartners.com/LTC.